Alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillahi wa ala alihi wa ashabihi wa wala. Rabbi shrah li sadri wa yassir li amri wahlul 'uqdatam min lisani yafqahu qawli. ربنا آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Welcome everybody to our very special session this month of March. We do every second Tuesday. We actually do a session for our convert brothers and sisters, our new Muslim, family. We do a session for them called the Convert Sadaqah, and this is a monthly thing that we do. Uh, and upon their request and their desire to learn about this topic, we put this together, this workshop on wills and estates, and decided to open this up to the rest of the community as well. So welcome to this seminar on wills and estates. I My name is Imam Aarij, and I will be hosting the seminar. And with me is our presenter for today, Brother Mustafa Jilani. Brother Mustafa is one of our esteemed community members. He's been part of the London Muslim Mosque board. He served there, alhamdulillah. He's a lawyer, a practicing lawyer by profession. And this is a presentation that he has given in many, many Islamic centers and masjids across the southwest Ontario, across Toronto, and in London as well. And now we're really blessed to have him here to give this presentation to us virtually. A quick note about how we will proceed, inshallah, with the seminar. We are going to have a PowerPoint presentation that you will be watching, inshallah, on the screen. We will be recording this session and uploading it on our YouTube afterwards for people to catch up on. And as for the questions and answers, I will post a link where you can put your questions and answers, inshallah. And that is a place that after we've gone through the presentation, we'll pull up that web app and go through all the questions that people have asked. That will be live shortly. In the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in Surah Nisa, Surah number 4, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala lays out the rules of inheritance. And these rules are laid out from ayah number 11 to ayah number 13. And these are long ayat. These span a large part of the page of the Quran if you were to look at the Quran as a page. And there's one more ayah at the end of Surah Nisa that has the rulings about a specific case of inheritance, and there are some ahadith of the Prophet ﷺ on the matter. But this is one of those topics that the Quran has taken the care to address. If you look at the prayer, the salah, which is a pillar of Islam, in fact, it is the second pillar and the pillar of Islam that we practice the most frequently. We don't find the details of how to pray in the Quran. We find the importance of salah in the Quran. We find, for example, a reference to the timing of the salah. We find repeated instructions to aqimus salah, establish the prayer, because it's not just meant to be something that we go through the motions with. It is something that we really, commit ourselves to wholeheartedly. Our bodies, our minds, our souls, we commit to it. The Quran focuses a lot on the why you should pray and the importance of it and the value what you get out of it. The how you pray is left to the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. The Quran does not actually comment on how the prayer is to be prayed. That is explained by the Prophet ﷺ in its entirety. Okay? Whereas this particular aspect of Islam, inheritance, the Quran has very specific instructions of how the inheritance is to be divided, of the inheritance of a deceased person is to be divided. Very, very clear, very unambiguous instructions. And the fatwas on this, the opinions on inheritance, are not from Imam Abu Hanifa or Imam Malik, Imam Shafi'i, Imam Ahmad, who are later scholars. The fatwas on this is from the early Sahaba, from Abu Bakr, from Umar. The issues of inheritance, there's a issue or a particular case that's called Mas'ala Umariya. The Umar's judgment of a case, his fatwa that became the precedence for future generations of practicing Muslims to imply to excuse me to apply the rulings of inheritance by. The point is, this is how uh, important this matter was, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala addressed it in detail in the Quran. The Prophet explained it quite explicitly. The Sahaba were very clear about it. And the earliest of Sahaba, the most important of the Sahaba, their fatwas are the ones that set the precedence for this particular issue, this particular topic, the topic of inheritance. That should tell you about how important this topic is. I also will tell you something. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when He begins the topic of inheritance, He begins by saying, Yusikumullahu fi awladikum. Allah is giving you, uh, instruction when it comes to your children. The idea here is that this is instruction that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is giving. He's taking care in giving this instruction. This is not just something that is coming, like it's something that coming from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, yusikumullahu fi awladikum, it carries that extra weight. And this is something that Allah, if we were to understand it, there is benefit in it, because the instruction for this, the guidance for this is coming from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Yusikumullahu fi awladikum. That's one thing. And then at the end of this, at the end of the passage, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala finishes talking about this, right? He calls this tilka hududullah. These are the limits set by God. These are the limits set by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وَمَنْ يُطِعِ اللَّهَ وَرَسُولَهُ يُدْخِلْهُ جَنَّاتٍ تَجْرِي مِنْ تحتها الأنهار تحتها الأنهار خالدين فيها وذلك الفوز العظيم. Anyone who obeys God and His Messenger will be admitted to the gardens through which rivers flow, to live there forever. And that will be the supreme achievement. وَمَنْ يَعْصِ اللَّهَ وَرَسُولَهُ وَيَتَعَدَّ حُدُودَهُ يُدْخِلْهُ نَارًا خَالِدًا فِيهَا وَلَهُ عَذَابٌ مُهِينٌ. But anyone who disobeys God and His Messenger and transgresses His limits shall be cast into a fire wherein he will abide forever, and he shall have a humiliating punishment. Notice how the ayah began, the passage began by mentioning about the care and concern Allah has for our inheritors, and He lays this out, these instructions. At the end of it, He says, these are the limits that Allah has set. Hududullah. Don't cross these limits. These are the boundaries. Don't overstep these boundaries. The one who observes this has obeyed Allah and His Messenger, and that will be a way for them to attain paradise. And whoever chooses to cross these boundaries, that is a person who has put themselves at the situation where they would be cast into naran khalidan fiha, into a fire wherein they will abide forever. So these are serious matters of our faith, serious matters of our salvation, and thus we should be cognizant of that, and we should learn about this, and inshallah work to implement that. With that introduction, I will turn it over to our dear esteemed guest, Brother Mustafa, and I will pin his video there, so his video will be mashallah, there the whole time. And if you have a question or comment, please, as I mentioned earlier, ask that in the link, the Slido link, which I will post right now. Brother Mustafa, please go ahead. Jazakallah khair.
Assalamu alaikum. Jazakallah khairan, Sheikh Imam Aarij Anwer. I appreciate the invite. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. We always begin in the name of Allah. The presentation today is wills and estates, and it's important not only from a legal perspective, but as Imam Aarij Anwer was discussing, it's also very important from an Islamic perspective. And it's something that we don't necessarily pay much attention to in our flurry of living life. A lot of people only think about wills, and I'll talk to you about what an estate means, once the situation is dire and they're looking at the end of it. And that's when they realize, oh my God, I don't have a will. How do I now take care of my affairs? So this is precisely why things like this have not only been considered from a legal perspective, but Islam is way more advanced than our current system of jurisprudence. Islam dictated this 1400 years ago. So subhanAllah, we're actually ahead of the game in this. And as the Sheikh outlined, we're going to discuss not only wills from a legal perspective today, but I'm going to touch upon the Islamic side with the help of Sheikh Aarij as well, because I'm not an Islamic scholar, and that's the reason why I'm glad he's there with us today. And so in this presentation, I'm going to go over a few general points about wills and estates. Now, I know as we're going through the presentation, some of you will have specific questions about your estate and you may want to ask those questions. This may not be the right forum to ask specific questions, so I'd encourage you to get in touch with me or Imam Aarij afterwards and then try and ask your specific questions. But obviously, if you have general questions of a generic nature, which would benefit everyone, then I would ask you to just put it in the chat and we'll address it at the end of the seminar. Now, in the introduction, Imam Aarij also said, I have done this seminar at several masjids across Ontario, but this is actually the first time I'm doing it over Zoom. So if we do have technical difficulties or you see something going awry, just forgive that, and then inshallah we'll proceed. But okay, so this is just a general slide, but essentially we're a law firm that's located right across the London Muslim Mosque. We have an office both in London and in Toronto, so notwithstanding where you're located, we can assist you, inshallah. The interesting thing about the COVID-19 pandemic is that it's actually made regulations a lot more flexible now, where we actually have things done remotely. So I'll discuss that. If everybody can just put yourself on mute, inshallah. So as I said, it doesn't matter where you're located nowadays. I'll talk a bit more about how the regulations have been amended to allow for virtual wills as well, virtual will signing. Obviously, being a lawyer, I have to give you a disclaimer. The presentation here is of a general nature. It's not meant to give you advice for your specific estate, but inshallah, hopefully it'll benefit you to get you thinking about what you need to think about for your estate plan. Now, in terms of what we're going to be doing today, this is essentially going to be a 45 minute long presentation with 15 to 20 minutes of just questions afterwards. We're going to talk about wills, estate planning, Islamic wills, and then go ahead and have questions. Now, this is obviously from the Islamic perspective a very important topic, which is the reason why the Sheikh outlined the verses in Surah Baqarah, which talks about wills, right? And we're going to talk about that aspect of Islamic inheritance as well, because it's very, very specific. All right, now let's start at the basics. What is a will? Essentially, a will is a legal document that is used after you pass away to dictate what happens to your wealth. Now, a will is essentially a document that only has legal significance after you pass away. As it says, takes effect only upon death. It has to be in writing. So the fact that, in Islamic law, a will, can be oral, but obviously in this jurisdiction, you have to have your wishes in writing. The requirement essentially is that you have to have it in writing and it has to be witnessed by two individuals. The new regulations that have come in now allow for virtual witnessing of wills with the stipulation that one of your witnesses has to be a lawyer. So this is basically to encourage people to still go ahead and make wills during the pandemic, obviously without having the need to meet in person. But there's a stipulation in there in the regulation that says one of your witnesses has to be a lawyer. This is to ensure that things are done properly, even though the lawyer is not physically meeting with you. It's also the only way for us as Muslims living in Canada to have the Islamic distribution implemented for our wealth, right? You cannot just expect that I'm not going to have a will, I'm going to pass away, and then now things will happen Islamically. It doesn't work like that, which is why the next question talks about, and I'll talk to you, what happens if I pass away without a will, but we'll get there in a second. But within the will, there are certain few key players, right? Essentially, the will is designed to transfer your wealth, which is called your estate. So everything that you own at the time of your demise is basically your wealth. It's called your estate. So the moment you pass away, everything that you own is put together and it's called the estate of such and such person, right? Now that estate is essentially transferred to your beneficiaries through your will. Beneficiaries are the people who essentially inherit from you, right? Now, how does that actually happen? Well, within the will, you have an individual called the executor. Essentially, it's the estate administrator, or nowadays, the regulations actually call them the estate trustee. So the estate trustee is essentially entrusted with administering your will. So what they're responsible for is taking care of all of your wealth. They're basically gathering all of your marbles, and now they're supposed to administer the details of your will according to your wishes. That's the job of the estate trustee, i.e. the executor. And so it's a very important position. So essentially you have your executor, you have your beneficiaries, and obviously if you have kids, you also have to appoint guardians. The guardian is obviously somebody who is going to look after your children if both parents pass away. If one of the parents passes away, it's assumed that the other parent will become the automatic guardian. But we're concerned about the scenario where both parents pass away. And that's something we would include in the will as well. Now the question arises, what happens if I pass away without a will? Well, the government has laws to take care of this scenario. These are called the laws of intestacy. Essentially, under the Succession Law Reform Act, it's the government regulations that dictate what happens to your estate, right? Now, most people may not want the government to dictate what happens to their estate, which is why a will is important. The government regulation, and I'll give you a few examples of what happens under the regulations. Unlike what most people think, it doesn't necessarily mean the government's going to take away your wealth entirely. It actually has stipulations on who gets what, depending on whether you have a spouse, whether you have kids, how many kids, etc. Only if they're not able to identify any relatives or next of kin will the estate then go to the government, go to the crown. Now, if you don't have a will, the courts will essentially appoint an estate trustee for your estate, right? So you don't have a choice in that matter because you didn't have a will. The courts will appoint an estate trustee, and now that estate trustee or executor is in charge of administering your estate, right? It also causes a lot of issues from a probate perspective, and I'll tell you what probate means. Essentially what that means is when you're administering your estate through the court system, that's called probate. So for a lawyer who essentially is helping a client deal with the estate for a person who's passed away without a will, it's a lot more cumbersome, a lot more difficult. You're going to be paying a lot more in legal fees. You're going to be spending a lot more time administering and resolving the issues in the estate. And essentially it's a delayed distribution to the beneficiaries as dictated by the government regulation. So it's not a nice scenario to be in, right? Now, this is something that's important as well, because when you pass away, you know what they say, you know how the Americans say there's two things guaranteed in life, death and taxes, right? Well, when you pass away, your estate is essentially taxed. Now, what is this tax? What is this? What tax am I talking about? In common parlance, it's in layman's terms, it's known as death taxes, but it's not really death taxes. Essentially, what it is when you pass away, everything that you own is brought together and a figure is assigned and a value is assigned to your estate, right? That value is essentially the total value of everything that you own, your bank accounts, your property, et cetera, et cetera. Let's say it's $1 million, right? Because you have properties, bank accounts, et cetera, stock investments. Now, whatever the value of that estate is, in order for the will to be submitted to the court and probated, and as I said, I'll explain to you what probate means, the court is going to ask for an estate administration tax to be paid into the court before even looking into the will. Now, this estate administration tax is essentially a tax on the value of your estate, which currently sits at approximately 1.5% of the value of the estate. So as I gave you an example here, if you have an estate worth $500,000, which is very, very common these days because people own property and people own bank accounts and other assets, then your family is essentially left with a bill of $7,000+ that has to be paid up front before the will is even considered. So that's an upfront cost. Now, we'll discuss strategies on how to reduce your probate cost. We'll discuss how to estate plan so as to reduce your tax liability, and we'll kind of discuss how it's important to not only talk to lawyers but accountants as well when you're doing this. So we'll move on to the next slide. This is essentially the process of estate planning. That's the reason why when people come to us and say, I need a will done, lawyers always talk about wills and estate because it's two sides of the same coin. If you just go ahead and get a will done, you're not really doing things properly. You can find will templates online. There's people and companies that offer you will templates online. You can print them off, and people think, oh, you know what? I'm done. $20 and I have a will. Well, you know what they say in life: you get what you pay for. If you just have a will done, you're not really planning for your estate, because now you might end up with an estate that's ill-planned. And when I say ill-planned, it essentially means you haven't done any planning to organize your affairs in such a way so as to reduce your taxes and other implications at the time of your death. You might have a will, that's fine, and the will says, distribute everything to such and such a person. But if you haven't really organized your affairs in a proper way, no matter what the will says, your estate is going to have to pay off these taxes and other liabilities before even distributing things. So that's the reason why lawyers talk about estate planning. We try and look at your affairs and we say, okay, how do we best organize your estate so we have a smooth transfer of property, smooth transfer of wealth in the most cost-effective, efficient manner, right? Now, obviously, as Muslims, we are also concerned about Islamic distribution, right? We have all heard about, as the Imam was talking about how the Islamic inheritance laws within the Quran are very, very black and white in terms of what the distribution ought to be from an Islamic perspective. So how do we now fulfill this requirement of our faith as well, right? If you've ever looked into the Islamic distribution, you'll realize and you'll see that you only have discretion over 1/3 of your estate, and the remaining is distributed according to Islamic Sharia. And even with that 1/3, you cannot take a portion of that 1/3 and give it to people who are already receiving an Islamic share. So that's why, it's basically that 1/3 is designed to give to people who are not receiving an Islamic share, like charitable bequests or other people, etc. And we'll talk a little bit about that. It's interesting when I was researching Islamic inheritance laws, because even though I'm not an Islamic scholar, it became part and parcel of my wills and estates practice, where I had clients who repeatedly early on in my career would ask me, I need an Islamic will, I need an Islamic will. So I had to educate myself in that area of law. And I found that the Islamic inheritance laws, subhanAllah, 1400 years ago, they were more complex and more intricate than any laws that you can find here in the Western world. And it's profound in how detailed Islamic distribution is. It's literally a work of art. And I know people question about whether or not it's fair, especially with regards to male-female ratio, etc. But I'll talk to you about that as well. And I'm sure Sheikh Aarij can also give you some insight into why it is the way it is, right? So you'll realize I'm not reading off the slides. Basically, it doesn't make sense for me to do so. So I'm expecting you're reading the slides as I'm presenting as well. If I miss any information, don't worry, I'll hopefully get to it through the presentation as well. By the way, Sheikh Aarij, if there's something that you want to say about Islamic inheritance and wills while I'm presenting this section, please feel free to interject as well. All right. Now, within the Western Canadian legal context, you're actually free to distribute your wealth however you see fit. So the law here gives you the discretion to leave behind your wealth to whoever, with a few caveats. And obviously, Islamic law dictates to us what the distribution should be in terms of our inheritance, right? So can I make an Islamic will living in Ontario? Short answer, yes. But it's a little bit more complicated than that, right? As I was saying, within the context of living in Ontario, Canada, there are certain protective entrenched rights that we have to now take into consideration. So for example, a surviving spouse, that is a legally married spouse, in this jurisdiction, if they don't like the distribution, that if they don't like the inheritance that was left behind for them in their deceased spouse's will, that spouse legally has the right to ignore the will and ask for what's called an equalization. So what does that mean? Essentially, it's when I say equalization, it's not necessarily half-half. It's more akin to if your husband is worth $100,000 and your wife has assets worth $50,000, and the husband passes away, the wife by law can say, you know what, I want an equalization, which means the courts will now equalize the two spouses. So from the husband's 100,000, 25,000 will be transferred over to the wife, so that now the wife sits at 75 and the husband's estate sits at 75. So if you haven't left enough of your estate for your spouse, know that here in Ontario, there is the right to ask for an equalization. By the way, for those who have ever looked into family law, this is where that right comes from. When you are getting separated from your spouse or getting divorced, the courts equalize net family property, right? Basically, between the two spouses. So it's the same scenario here when one of the spouses passes away. Also, the courts give certain dependents rights to ask for a portion of the inheritance as well, even if they're not necessarily qualified to be Islamic beneficiaries. If you were supporting a certain individual and they can prove that, you know what, this person used to support me, or I am a dependent child, let's say, then in that case, the courts will allow them to make a dependent claim. This is sometimes in a scenario where, let's say, because within the Islamic law context, only children who are from within your marriage can inherit, right? Children outside do not inherit, nor do non-Muslims inherit within an Islamic law context. But from a legal perspective, those dependents can make a claim against your estate. And so you have to balance these two considerations, right? Other considerations with regards to Islamic inheritance. Now, you have to appreciate that when you're talking about Islamic inheritance, there is a distribution that may at the outset seem a little unfair. So for example, typically when it's a husband who passes away, the portion that gets left behind under Islamic law for a wife is usually 1/4 or 1/8, right? Now, and as we know, it's typically half to the daughters as to the sons, right? If you have a pure Islamic distribution like this for an estate, right, you might run into certain tax complications as well. Let's say, for example, you have an RRSP. An RRSP, the moment you pass away, it's basically deemed to have been disposed. And so there's tax implications to that, right? Capital gains tax. But if you transfer the RRSP to your spouse, that tax is deferred. But if the will says, you know what, I'm not transferring everything to my spouse, I'm actually only giving her 1/8, now you have to take into consideration, okay, tax consequences of actually giving the RRSP or the family home to somebody else other than a spouse. This is the reason why I tell people, when you're looking at doing a pure Islamic will, don't just go online, look up a masjid's website, pull up their template of an Islamic will and say, yes, I'm going to fill this out and that's it, I'm done. Because you have no idea what kind of implications that has on your particular estate. Yes, you might be fulfilling your quote unquote Islamic obligation, but you might be leaving a headache behind for your family to resolve without understanding the implications of what you've just done. And that's the reason why I always encourage people, look, leave the advice of a certain area to the professionals in that area. You're not going to administer medicine upon yourself without consulting a doctor, because if you do, it's not a smart thing to do. Just like that, you wouldn't make legal moves within your life without consulting a professional who would know the ramifications of those moves. Because I've seen way too many times people pull up Islamic will templates from some masjid or something or some online website and say, oh, Brother Mustafa, will this work for me? I say, well, I have to look at your estate. I have to take a look at what the implications are of this distribution on what you own. And then you have to decide how best to deal with this, right? And we'll discuss a little bit more of that when we have the question and answer session as well. I don't want to discourage you from one or the other. I'm just giving you knowledge and advice on things that you're thinking about implications, right? So essentially, the question now arises, what now? How do we fulfill our Islamic obligation while also taking into consideration the context that we're living in, right? It's we have to have a understanding of what we're trying to achieve and how best to achieve it, right? If you talk to different imams and sheikhs who have ever studied this area, especially those who live in the West, and I have done so as well, and I've realized, just like in many other facets of Islamic law, you get different opinions based on who you ask. So you as the consumer, you as the believer, have to understand and make your own decision as to what you need to do and how you need to proceed when it comes to these things, right? So let me give you an example. As I said, within a pure Islamic will context where you've taken the Islamic distribution and say, this is exactly how I want it, in a scenario where let's say you have a husband who passes away, leaving behind a wife and 2 daughters. Now in that scenario, and the husband has parents as well. In that scenario, the parents of the husband inherit a portion. The wife also receives a small portion, and then the 2 daughters also receive a portion. Although, if you look at it, the wife actually receives the smallest portion of everybody else. Now, that is under the context of Islamic law, assuming that the male members of the family will take care of said wife and daughters, because that's the Islamic jurisprudence. It's a holistic jurisprudence, right? You can't necessarily say, I'm only taking one part of it and not implementing the other. And so the question arises, how do we fulfill both of our goals of trying to fulfill our Islamic obligation while also fulfilling the rights upon those who we're leaving behind, right? And so there are a few options depending on your estate. We can discuss those options. One of the common options that we have is essentially where we have what we call a hybrid will, where we have an estate, the person passes away, and upon that person's passing, we transfer everything over to the surviving spouse with a religious directive in the will that essentially dictates or advises the spouse to now distribute what they have received Islamically. Now, what that does is it essentially distinguishes between legal distribution versus moral religious obligation, right? Legally, we're going to allow the spouse to have full control over the estate, but morally, religiously, we've instructed the spouse to now distribute what they have received Islamically, right? And at that time, if the male members of the family so choose, they can waive their rights or discuss it amongst the family as to how best to go ahead and distribute it Islamically. This is not to say that we cannot have an Islamic distribution built into the will as well. We've done plenty of wills like that. It's just that you have to understand the implications of doing that within your particular estate context, right? And obviously, you also have the testamentary freedom to distribute things as you see fit, taking into consideration your own scenario, because that's what Canadian law allows you to do. As I said, deferring opinions, but ultimately, you have to make that decision. I, as a lawyer, cannot make that decision for you. And as a believer, I cannot tell you one way or the other as to what you should choose, right? Before I get into this, I just wanted to give you an appreciation of the fact that a will is essentially a legal document that is only used after you pass away. However, there are situations in life before you've passed away where you're not able to take care of your affairs. Things like, you might have reached an age where you may not be fully mentally competent, you've come down with Alzheimer's or something or the other has happened to you, and you're not able to make those decisions for yourself. Well, what happens in that context? Well, just because you have a will doesn't mean the executor can now step in. No, because you haven't yet passed away. That's where another estate planning document comes into play. It's called a continuing power of attorney for property. Essentially, this is a document where you have given somebody else, maybe your spouse or another trusted relative, the authority to control all of your affairs if you are deemed incapable of doing so, right? So essentially, whoever you appoint has the authority to now deal with your bank account, has the authority to deal with your property, etc. Once you are already mentally incapable, it's too late to make this power of attorney. That's the reason why it's part of estate planning to have this document prepared in advance. So we typically prepare it at the same time as preparing your will. Similarly, especially nowadays with people being in hospital in isolation under COVID-19 and medical procedures being done upon them, whereby the doctors may be making decisions for the patient, and the patient may not necessarily be in a situation to give the decision to make a decision themselves. Let's say they're intubated, right? Now that's where another document called a continuing power of attorney for personal care comes in. This is where you essentially give somebody else the authority to make medical decisions on your behalf in a medical context, where you basically dictate, if I'm unable to make a decision, then let this person make those decisions for me. Do I go ahead with this procedure? Do you want to pull the plug, etc., right? And if you actually want to outline specifically what those medical decisions should be, you can actually have a document called an Advanced Healthcare Directive drafted up, which essentially outlines to the power of attorney holder what decision to make if you're ever in that medical context, right? This too is a document that has to be made beforehand, because once you're already in the hospital, it's too late to make that document. So this is another one of those estate planning documents, right? Now, coming back to that Islamic aspect of why a will is important. The purpose of this presentation is essentially to impress upon you the importance of thinking about this, because way too many people call up lawyers in a situation where lawyers can no longer help them. I recently posted on the London, Ontario Muslims group a phone call that I had with a brother. A brother from Waterloo gave me a call, and he said, my father is in the ICU, and I don't know what's going to happen because things don't look too good, but my father doesn't have a will. What do I need to do? Now, in that situation, even though lawyers are now allowed to have virtual will signings, unfortunately, his father was in the ICU, and he was there because of COVID, and he was intubated. So there was very little hope that I was going to get any instructions from the father. I cannot, as a lawyer, take instructions from a son. I have to take instructions from the actual testator, right? So it was too late for that father to now think about estate planning, or for his family to think about estate planning, because it's near the end. So I told him, look, just give me a call when your father recovers even a little bit, then perhaps we can do something. Right? So don't be that guy who waits until the last minute to think about this, because you never know when it's going to be time. Right? This is the reason why the Quran talks about it, and our Hadith talk about it, and we're obligated as Muslims to get it done as soon as possible. Now, what I'd like to do is, if you have questions, I typically prefer having verbal questions. I'm not sure what the London Muslim Mosque's scenario here is. I think it's the preferred option of having just chat questions. But sorry, go ahead, Imam.
Yes, so we have a couple questions that were asked on the Slido app. Do you mind if I put that up, and then we can also open up the floor for people who want to ask questions by unmuting themselves? Is that okay, inshallah?
Yeah, sounds
okay.
Good.
Very good. Jazakallah khair. If you all, can someone like raise their hand on Zoom? Like, is that something that's enabled here, please? Okay, perfect, brother Habib. Jazakallah khair. Okay, so please raise your hands, and then what we'll do is I will just keep that as the order of questions or questioners. For those who want to ask a question verbally. But in the meantime, I will actually share my screen, inshallah, and share with you the Slido. The Slido is the place where we're all asking, we're just aggregating the questions. And if you like to aggregate your question, you can do so here. Alhamdulillah. Here is the link for it in the chat. Jazakumullah khairan. Okay, let me read the question, and Brother Mustafa, you can answer it, inshallah. Sounds good?
Sure.
All right. What is the typical cost of a will if you have no property or wealth?
Okay, so if you have no property or wealth, essentially a will is used to distribute your property or wealth, right? If you don't have any property or wealth, I'm trying to think about why you would think about a will necessarily. Now, obviously, from an Islamic perspective, it's encouraged because you're bound to have something that you own. And so, in terms of a cost, as with any lawyer, I would say it depends on how complex your estate is, right? A very simple will with a very simple distribution would start at, for example, my office charges $299 for a very simple will. But if you ask for a complex estate with trust planning, Islamic inheritance built into the will, then you're looking at higher charges. But we do have packages that we offer to clients. But as I said, discuss your specific needs with a lawyer. I don't encourage you just to reach out to myself. I'm not here to advertise my firm. I'm here to just give you information, right? So discuss your estate with a lawyer, and then they can give you a quote on what your estate plan and wills would cost, inshallah.
Jazakallahu khairan. Let's look at the next question here. There's a few questions in the chat, so maybe after this, I'll read the questions from the chat. And anybody who wants to ask a question, again, please raise your hand and keep it raised in Zoom using the icons, and then I will unmute you, and then you can, inshallah, ask your question verbally as well. Is it easier to process the will Islamically once both spouses pass away? Is that why we transfer it to the spouse first when one parent dies? Mustafa.
Okay, no, you don't want to necessarily think about it like that, but because Islamic law is very precise in its distribution scheme. Basically, it dictates, you have to remember, each person has their own estate. The husband and the wife each have their own estate. So when the husband passes away, Islamic law will dictate what happens to that person's estate. And then when the wife passes away, same thing. What I was talking about was basically dividing the responsibility. So essentially, if within your will you have the Islamic distribution written, right, then your immediate family has no say, because the will already dictates this is the Islamic distribution and this is how it should be distributed. And so that's how it will be distributed legally, because that's what it says in the will. Whereas if you transfer everything, for simplicity's sake, let's say, if you transfer your entire wealth over to your surviving spouse and then have them distribute things Islamically internally, because remember, legally, they're the full owner of everything you've transferred to them. probate process, everything is done. So legally, it's all theirs. But now, Islamically, you've left them the obligation of distributing it according to Quran and Sunnah, right? Now, what that does is Islamic law is very unique in the sense that the distribution changes depending on who's alive in your family. So at the time of your death, the distribution scheme crystallizes. What that means is you know exactly what the percentages are because you know who's alive at the time of this person's death. And so when you've transferred everything to your surviving spouse, or let's say, first, if your spouse is no longer there, to your children, they are now left with, if you have it in your will, the religious obligation to distribute it Islamically. So let's say the surviving spouse says, you know what, my husband's parents are still alive. They're entitled to a portion. She will then take from the wealth a portion, the Islamic portion for the parents, and so on and so forth. At that time, if the son says, you know what, I don't really need double what my sister is receiving, I'm okay to waive my inheritance. Islamically, you have that right to waive your inheritance, and then the sister can take the same division as the son. So that's what I was discussing. This is an option. This is not necessarily what I'm recommending. This is an option. There are various options on how we go about fulfilling what may be best for your estate. And I, as a lawyer, typically discuss all of these options with the client and let them decide. There's actually only a handful of wills and estates lawyers in the Muslim community that take into consideration Islamic inheritance and can plan it accordingly. So just be careful how you go about it, who you choose to give you that advice.
Jazakallah khair. One comment, if I can make, Brother Mustafa, before we
Yes, yes, please.
proceed, right? I actually copy pasted the question from the chat in the Slido, encouraging people to do so, inshallah, there if you can. I know there's a character limit, but perhaps you can break up your questions in a couple of questions if you do choose to do that. That'll be great. At one point about the distribution, like the Quran says, لِلذَّكَرِ مِثْلُ حَظِّ الْأُنْثَيَيْنِ, that the basic rule of inheritance is that the male gets twice that of the female. Uh, there are circumstances where, for example, the male and female get actually identical. فَهُمْ شُرَكَاءُ فِي الثُّلُث. For example, the case of step brothers and sisters, if they are inheriting, like they're inheriting someone, and they're step brothers and sisters from the mom's side, right? Like they have a common mother but different fathers, like maybe from a different marriage, a same lady had different kids. Then in that case, that particular instance is one example where both the children, the both genders get the same amount. So that's point number one to keep in mind. Point number two also is that even if we were to put that example aside and those examples aside, the idea of in Islam is that that there's a principle which is al-ghunmu bil-ghurm. Okay, with responsibility comes with power comes responsibility, like Spider-Man says. Similar axiom in Islamic sciences you find, meaning if you are responsible, you are given more power. Okay. Uh, for example, you have a son who is financially liable for taking care of his mother after his father passes away. It is the responsibility of the son now, right? This is the opinion of the vast majority of scholars, if not a consensus on the matter. Only in the cases where the son is unable to, or son is extremely poor, that the daughters are they step in to help out, or they're held liable for that. And when I say held liable, meaning that they are held, they could be questioned by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala on the day of judgment. That's what I mean by that. So if the son is to be held in that position where they are questioned by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or could be questioned by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, for the financial well-being of his mother and other relatives, then it is only natural that this person or this son is given more of the inheritance. So that's one of the things that the Islamic law of inheritance doesn't operate in a vacuum. It is in a system where the system is that the male, the male head of the house is the one who is financially responsible and liable in the eyes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for taking care of his dependents. And even those who are older and become his dependents. It's his responsibility. And thus, since he has more responsibility, he's given more to fulfill those obligations and responsibilities. That's one wisdom that is shared. Then I just wanted to point that out to you all, inshallah ta'ala. Let us go back to the thing. By the way, again, you can raise your hand and I can unmute you and you can ask your question. Uh, no problem. I'm not sure if people are shy to speak on the mic, but no problem. I can keep reading from the questions here. Okay, let's go through the questions on the Slido. Uh, let me start. Where is this? Yes. Okay. So once the spouse takes over the will and estate, it reduces complications uh, for them once the demise. Okay, I think this was uh, part of a question. Let me find the whole question here for you. Hold on, please.
So while you're doing that, I just wanted to
Hmm.
confirm what you were saying, Imam Aarij. You're
Hmm.
right. Islamic law, on the face of it, a lot of people, when I talk about this topic, say it
Hmm.
seems unfair. But then I always tell them, look, you have to appreciate things in a holistic context, right?
Hmm.
The question that we as lawyers always struggle with, and this is something I need to have a discussion with Islamic scholars with, is
Hmm.
the implementation of the male inheritance rights
Hmm. Hmm.
without the subsequent obligation being enforced. So, for example, if
Hmm.
a sister gets divorced, or there, in that scenario, or her husband passes away, it becomes the responsibility of the other male members, if I'm correct me if I'm wrong, to
Hmm.
support her Islamically, right? To
Correct.
maintain
Correct.
her Islamically. But
Correct.
in a Canadian Ontario context, she can't ask her father-in-law, brother-in-law to financially maintain her, right? And so even though there's an Islamic obligation to do that, it's not enforceable within this context. And so
Hmm.
for us to now say, okay, we're going to draft um, wills that say double to the male as to the female, we're essentially giving males a benefit without asking the responsibilities of them in turn, right? So
Hmm.
it's a discussion that people should keep in mind, because it's an interplay between two established legal systems, right? You cannot necessarily take one and try and implement only parts of it into the other. So
Hmm.
as long as people appreciate that, we can obviously discuss your specific estate needs and your personal beliefs in a personal consult. But I wanted to just bring that to your attention.
Barakallah fik, jazakallah khair. The question I was actually trying to find in the correct order, alhamdulillah, Brother Habib says that question has been answered. Jazakallah khairan for answering that, Brother Mustafa, and Jazakallah khairan for Brother Habib for asking the question. Let's move on to the question. This was asked by, I believe, Sister Laura, who is one of our active participants in the converts group. She says, um, we have our family home is currently in my name. We both have wills, two grown children. Should we register our home in both our names? And this is the second part of the question. My husband has other properties in his name.
This is an excellent question, because this is basically part of estate planning. One of the first things we discuss with clients. Reason being, because your family home is typically your biggest asset. And in a lot of scenarios, we sometimes see that the family home is only in the name of one spouse or the other, right? So if that spouse passes away, what happens to that home, right? That's the question. Um, Ideally, I always encourage clients to have their family home in a joint ownership structure, because joint ownership essentially entails that if one of the owners passes away, the other owner assumes full ownership. It's a very simple transfer of property. Whereas if the property was only in one person's name, it now has to go through the probate process in order to rightfully transfer over to the beneficiaries, right? Obviously, there's considerations of family matrimonial homes as well. That's something we can discuss as well, because a spouse automatically has rights to half the matrimonial home, notwithstanding who's on title, but that's a family law consideration. So as you can appreciate, law is very nuanced. It all is context specific. But you're right. In your case, I would encourage you, add your spouse on title if you can, if the mortgage company allows it. Make them a joint owner on your family home so that if one of you passes away, the home remains in the name of the surviving spouse.
Awesome. Jazakallah khairan. That question was from Sister Isabella. Thank you for asking that question. And now Sister Laura asked the question about is the executor obliged to pay all bills of the deceased, if any, before the inheritance is distributed?
Great question. So basically, the first clause we put in a will before the distribution clauses are put in is that all debt and taxes owing for that estate have to be paid. And that's an expectation. Before we're even allowed to probate the will, basically there's a final return that is conducted, that is done on the deceased person's estate. Simple answer to your question, yes, all debts and taxes have to be paid, and they're typically paid from the estate.
Perfect. Follow up to that question was, and I'll come to Brother Naveed's question in a sec. I'm just going by my order here. Can a lawyer be appointed as an executor of will if you have no living relatives?
This is a good question as well, because essentially when you look at the estates of business people or people with a lot of wealth or other such folks with a lot of wealth, they typically appoint like their accountant or their lawyer as the executor. That's because they don't want issues within their family as to who gets the power. But 99% of cases are not like that. In most cases, people appoint their own immediate family members as executors. What we see most commonly is that people appoint spouses as their executors. And obviously, most lay people don't know how to administer an estate. So when that situation arises, the executor listed in the will typically ends up contacting an estate lawyer anyway, because they say, okay, well, I'm an executor in this will, but I don't know what to do. What's the next step, right? And so the estate lawyer would then guide them through the process, but the final decision still rests with the executor. But to answer your question, yes, it is possible to appoint a lawyer, but it's not commonly done. Right.
Perfect. Jazakallah khair. But Naveed asks the question, if all property bank accounts are jointly owned, do we still need a will? And do legal process or it rollovers to
Okay, I think
surviving
I
spouse without any
understand.
complications? Yeah, sorry, I'm trying to
No, I understand the question. Okay, Brother Naveed, in this regard, you have to think of a will as a catch-all document. It's basically like that safety net for your estate. So when lawyers are doing what's called estate planning, we try and tie up your affairs in other legal arrangements, such as, for example, your house. We encourage you to put your house in a joint ownership structure or your primary bank accounts in a joint ownership. That's because if you pass away, then your spouse has, by virtue of being a joint owner, has access to your bank account, can live and not necessarily live, can control the home, right? And so it's good to have certain things organized in prior legal arrangements. You have to think of a will as a document that is a safety net that catches things that are not already prearranged. So one of the best ways of actually doing estate planning is tying things up in prior legal arrangements, right? For example, if you happen to have registered plans, RRSP and whatnot, right? For these, you can actually designate beneficiaries right in the plan, which means you pass away, the beneficiaries receive that immediately without going through the will, right? So these are some of the tools lawyers use to do estate planning. And whatever it is that you haven't been able to plan for is what is then caught by the will. Or if a plan fails, then it's caught by the will and then dealt with accordingly.
Awesome. Jazakallah khair. Just to mix it up a little bit, we'll get a question from our audience right now who raised their hand. Just to kind of, make it less predictable. Alhamdulillah. As a Brother Habib, please go ahead. Jazakallah khair.
Brother Habib, you're live.
Oh, I'm live? Okay. Hey, assalamu alaikum. Sorry, I'm not used to Zoom. Just wondering, by the way, Jazakallah khairan for a great topic. This is a topic that is really, really important. and there's a lot of misconceptions about it. So what I'm trying to, like, let's say, for example, if we start our planning with you, what happens if our wealth grows? So do we come back and do we visit you once a year, or is it we give you a call right away and say, hey, I got some money in the bank now? Like,
No. Very
what's
good
the
question.
procedure?
So
Yeah.
the way lawyers draft wills, we draft wills taking into consideration the growth that you anticipate. That's the reason why we don't actually specify certain assets in a will unless it's an asset that you wish to specify, like my 1967 Mustang to my son. Unless it's something like that, we typically identify assets at the time of your death. So we say anything and everything that you own at the time of my demise, right? So you can own a house today, you can sell it tomorrow, you can own another house the day after. It doesn't matter. Even if your entire estate is in flux, we capture what we need to deal with on the day of your death, right? So I hope you can
Okay.
appreciate that. The will is drafted in such a way so as to accommodate future growth, but there are certain circumstances where your will should be, essentially looked at again. So if you
Updated.
get married, if you get divorced, or if a situation arises where you wish to leave something specific for a certain individual, right? That's
Okay.
when you might want to look at drafting your will again. But other than that, once it's made, it's there for like a long time.
Okay. Cool. Thank you.
No worries.
I appreciate it.
Jazakallahu khairan. Thank you very much for the question, Brother Habib. And nice to see you, alhamdulillah, as well. Is there a way to get a copy of your presentation, Brother Mustafa?
Okay, so what I'll do is right now, I'm going to actually send you all a link so that you can actually get a copy of the presentation. So basically, if you can just put in your details in there, we'll send you a copy of the presentation, inshallah. I hope
Perfect.
everybody can see it. I just put it up in the chat.
Perfect. That's the place to put it, alhamdulillah. Let us keep going. We have a few more questions left, and people, if you'd like to please add your questions, kindly do so in the Slido. That'll be really awesome. Are we allowed Islamically to gift away to our beneficiaries before our death? Any rules or restrictions?
That's a question for you, Sheikh.
So this is actually a very important a point of contention amongst the scholars, and a lot of these matters kind of go back to the intention of the person, right? It goes back to the intention and goes back a little bit to the reality of that person. For example, the scholars of fiqh mentioned that if someone is, as an example, this is an example they give. Don't read into it more than just that. If someone was to divorce their spouse the moment they're just about to die, right, or close to their death, now they've divorced their spouse, and the wife doesn't get anything now because she's no longer married to this person, right? The scholars would they say that this person, has done this firaran min tarika, right? He's done this to flee from giving away the money to the rightful individual, in this case the spouse, the wife, and that is something that will not count, and then she will be given, right? So these are examples that the scholars mention about this topic, that if you were to do this and it could be established you did it to kind of escape the laws of inheritance, then an Islamic judge in a Islamic system would overrule you and give the due to the people who deserve it, because this is considered to be their God-given right, right? The inheritance is considered to be the God-given right of the people that is mentioned in the laws of inheritance. So that's number one. Point number one. Point number two is, what about gifting assets before you pass away? This is a common practice in many Muslim cultures, that the father would gift away many, or not gift away, but kind of give away many of his assets to his sons before he dies, because that is a way for them to preserve assets within the family, quote unquote. This is again, goes back to the situation specifically. If the situation is that the son has lived with the son lives with the father, right? He lives in the same house as the father and has lived his whole life with the father, has served his father, right? then the father puts the house in the name of the son, that's less egregious, because in reality that's also his home, right? Whereas if the father has multiple properties, and they would have been distributed according to the laws of the Quran, but then this father decides to put certain properties in the name of one son, or all of those properties in the name of the sons, so the daughters don't get anything, that would be very, very egregious. And the thing is this: these matters a person can get away with in the dunya. Okay, this is the reality, right? And we don't live in a system where we can enforce the laws of the inheritance according to the Quran and Sunnah. We don't do that. We don't have that. And even in times where there was, the difficulty of proving this was, as you can appreciate, quite hard to prove this, that this is the person's intention or that's that person's intention. So at the end of the day, the reminder is given by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Tilka hududullah. These are the laws of God. These are the boundaries that Allah has drawn up. Don't cross it. And the one who crosses it is going to open themselves up to the wrath of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Imagine a person does all good work in his life, spends all this time doing good, and then at the end of it all loses it because they wanted to deny those who were given inheritance by Allah, deny them their inheritance. That's an egregious matter. So it goes back, wallahu alam, to the situation, to the intention. If the intention is good and sound, then no problem, alhamdulillah. If the intention is nefarious, then it is unacceptable, and then there's a lot of shades of gray between that black and white. I hope that answers the question. Let's move on. If a person divorces in the Islam law but not civil, what will happen?
We're now getting into a family law topic. Legally, you're still married. You might be Islamically divorced, but legally, you're still married.
Yeah, I would say, just as a FYI, don't create that conflict in your life, right? Keep everything in sync. That's just healthier for your health and your iman and your mental health, and also your status in terms of like how you are legally and everything. Just keep everything in sync. Wallahu a'lam. Would you agree with that, brother Mustafa?
Yeah, we get into a lot of complications when we have different things happening Islamically and then from a legal perspective, because people coming and saying, "Oh, I have my nikah done," but then, okay, do you have a marriage certificate? Or I'm divorced. I had my talaq, but then, okay, did you get a legal divorce? Because legally, your wife is still your wife. You cannot go marry another woman legally because she's still your wife, right? So there's a lot of issues. Just make sure everything is in sync.
Perfect. Jazakallah khair. Is there any instance where Ontario legal system will challenge and prevent Islamic legal rulings? Brother Mustafa.
Very, very interesting. So, there's more and more cases where the courts here are seeing Islamic law being brought in and as an argument. I mean, it first started with all the divorce cases in Mahar, and then the courts were like, what the heck is this Mahar thing? And they eventually, recognized an aspect of it. But when you're in this scenario, let me give you an example, and this is something that's happened in the past, where if you distribute Islamically and you give your daughters half of what you've given your sons, there is the potential that your daughters challenge the will on the basis of gender discrimination. And that's one of the charter protected rights, right? If they can prove that the only reason they received half is because they're female and for no other reason, then that clause in your will that says give, half to my daughter as to my sons is going to be struck out. But that's only an issue if your daughters actually challenge it. Same with the distribution to the wife, right? Islamically, let's say she's entitled to 1/8, but under the Family Law Act, she's gonna get half. Well, even though legally she has the right to challenge, to basically say, I'm ignoring the will and I want my right legally, and the courts will enforce that right and give her half. The question arises, well, she has the option. The courts are not going to enforce the laws here. The wife has to ask for that right in order for the court to do something, right? So if your wife says, you know what, I'm fine with the 1/8, I'm not going to challenge it, then that's fine. What you need to understand is this is two legal systems interacting, and obviously the courts here are not going to enforce Islamic law. They're going to enforce what their law is, right? But somebody actually has to ask for their right in order to circumvent Islamic law. So you have to have a discussion with your family.
Jazakallah khair. That's a really, really pertinent, very, very excellent example. Thank you very much for bringing that up, because that really, like, for me, clarifies, I guess, the that interaction or that intersection of the two systems of law that we are living in, right? We live in this, like, if you think of a Venn diagram, right? There's this little intersection of common law and Islamic law, and we live
Yeah,
in that place where they overlap a little bit. So
exactly.
you're right. A lot of this is goes back to how we, as people, right, take the common law and use it, for the lack of a better word. Right? Does that sound good?
You'd be surprised when it comes to, see, when everything is hunky-dory, everything's good. Everybody wants to follow Islamic law. But when things get testy, when people go to court, it's gloves off. And then it's unfortunate. That's the reason why I always tell people, have a discussion with your family beforehand, before you get ill or before you pass away, obviously, because you don't realize the complications that we're dealing with after you've passed away and between your children. The number of people that call us estate lawyers, Muslim people, with estate litigation files, sons and daughters and mothers and children fighting against each other for property. It's just sad. It's more common than you think.
Yeah, subhanallah. Jazakallah khair. Before we end with some of the final questions, I wanted to bring your attention to a couple of matters. Alhamdulillah, we have tomorrow this very excellent program that is for sisters only, sisters age 13 plus, called Does Your Creator Love You? This is in partnership with Al-Huda Institute and Alhamdulillah Quran His program, our local program. We are running this live online, free at this time, 6:30 p.m. It's starting February 14th, February 24th, but it's every other Wednesday, and so it's falling tomorrow on that Wednesday, inshallah. So please do come out for that, or if you have family members who are women who can benefit from this, please do come out for that. This is not meant from like a discrimination perspective. It's meant for an educational perspective, alhamdulillah. Also, I like you to just to point your attention to our masjid website, alhamdulillah, where there's this online lectures link, and we have all the events that are coming up. So this is, mashallah, the event that we're doing right now, Wills in the State. This is the program with Al-Maghrib Institute that we started, the Art of Quranic Reflection. This is a weekly halaqa I do with the MSA brothers and sisters, and it's a real fun one because we have lots of interesting questions asked and answered. And this is the Does Your Creator Love You, the program for sisters, and Quranic Arabic for new Muslims, which our convert brothers and sisters are enjoying learning from our Sheikh, dear friend of mine, Sheikh Ihsan. Very good, offering of programs. I encourage you to please check out our site and sign up for them, enroll in them. These are all free. All of these programs are free, so you can benefit, inshallah. Last question that's here on the list is, how long after someone's death does the wealth have to be divided, Brother Mustafa?
So typically, the court gives the executor a lot of discretion to deal with the estate, but it's expected that the executor wrap things up within 1 year. It's an expectation, not a requirement. The only people who can challenge an executor are the beneficiaries. So if the executor is taking too much time to wrap things up, the beneficiaries can challenge the executor in court and say, look, this guy's taking too long. Court, can you either, ask them to wrap this up, or get somebody else appointed? Because within your will, we actually recommend you appoint 3 executors who act one after the other. If the first one's unavailable, predeceased, or unable, then the second one steps in, etc. So it's not just one person you would appoint, it's actually 2. In that regard, I actually wanted to, Sheikh Aarij, if you'll allow me, I wanted to post a quick link here, because now that everybody's thinking about wills, I want you to just kind of jot that those thoughts down on that form that I just sent right here, because you'll be surprised how many people listen to this lecture and then never think about wills again. And it'll only come up once it hits them, like somebody's in the hospital, oh my God, I need to think about this. So if you fill in that form, it'll take you 2 seconds. That form basically tells you to jot down your own thoughts of who you think should be the executor, who you think should be the guardian of your children. And it basically, the form sends you an email so that it's a reminder to yourself to follow up on your will at a future date, inshallah. So I'd encourage you to just click on that link and fill in that
That's
form as
awesome.
well.
Barakallah
Inshallah.
fiqh. We will share that link on the WhatsApp group as well, so people can continue doing that. Alhamdulillah. I think we have one last question asked by Dr. Mithwani here. I'll read it, and inshallah we'll conclude with that. Um, if the investments are all, if the investments are all assets, investments and all assets are held in joint names. Uh, it the surviving spouse becomes owner of total assets. Is this allowed Islamically? If I understand the question correctly, I think it's if all assets that say a husband or a wife owns, just for the sake of simplicity, let's imagine it's a husband. He owns assets, but they're all jointly held with his wife. Okay, house, whatever, stock, and then the husband passes away. The surviving spouse, the wife, becomes the owner of the total assets. Is this allowed Islamically? The wife can, as we were discussing in that hybrid will scenario, right? The wife, if she becomes the owner of these assets, it is her responsibility then to disperse of it according to the laws of inheritance. Uh, if in the case where there is no other surviving relative, like there is nobody, right? No son, no daughter, nothing. Only the wife is left behind. Then the wife takes it's everything is hers, right, for her to keep. If there is a son, for example, that this is a person, they had a son, and they left behind a son and a wife, then the wife will get 1/8 and the son will get 7/8, as an example, right? So those, now you get into the specific fractions of the Islamic inheritance, and it's how it's broken down. But alhamdulillah, the answer is allowed Islamically, in the sense as the wife becomes the wakil, the executor of the Islamic will, according to the Quran and Sunnah. She becomes the executor, not the entire owner of it. But in the case where there's no other, warith, no other inheritor, or no other heir, then obviously the wife will have, it will be all hers. It will be all of her inheritance. Wallahu a'lam. So with that, alhamdulillah, concludes our session. This was an excellent session. Jazakallah khairan, Brother Mustafa, for presenting so succinctly, so beautifully, so eloquently, and answering all our questions. Thank you very much for all of you all for attending and participating. I think this was the best participated or attended session that we've had in all the ones that we've been doing. Alhamdulillah. So this was fantastic. And I hope that you all will continue to come out to the programs that we're doing. And if you have suggestions of what you want to hear about, please do share them with us. And I think, Brother Mustafa, we should make this like a yearly event, maybe bi-yearly, because
we need to have a discussion on Islamic inheritance and the context of how we can make it work within the Canadian system.
brother, let's do it, inshallah. Once this COVID thing kind of dies down, we have that discussion over some burgers, inshallah, that you're gonna cook for me.
No, you're too kind. Actually, you're the one who invited me. I wanted to thank you, Jazakallah khairan, to the London Muslim Mosque for hosting this presentation as well. It's an important topic and something that I'm glad we were able to cover, because the intention here is to benefit the community, and I appreciate you doing all these programs that you're pushing for at the LMM and getting everybody in the community involved, even if it's virtually. Jazakallah khairan, everybody. If you have any other questions, I'm going to put my email address in the chat here so that everybody has it, just in case. If you have my questions, email me. I'll try and answer what I can, and we'll take it from there.
Inshallah. Barakallahu feekum. Thank you very much, everybody. We'll post the recording on our channels, the WhatsApp groups, and the WhatsApp broadcast. Bi'idhnillahi ta'ala, so keep an eye out for that. Thank you very much. Subhanakallahumma wa bihamdika. Nashhadu an la ilaha illa anta nastaghfiruka wa atubu ilaik. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam.